You're listening to the Archetype Effect, conversations redefining power, purpose and leadership for women and the coaches who guide them. I'm Ros Cardinal, leadership coach and creator of the Women's Leader Archetypes. Together we'll explore the real stories, the research and reflections that help women rise with clarity and authentic power. Have you ever walked into a meeting prepared and realised within the first few minutes that everyone else seemed to be having a conversation you hadn't been part of? You've done the work, you've read the papers, you've thought through the risks, you know what you want to say. You may even have rehearsed the difficult parts in your head on the way in. And yet, almost immediately, something feels off. A comment is made that seems to carry more weight than it should. Someone refers to a concern as though everyone already knows about it. A person you expected to be undecided sounds strangely certain. Another person supports the idea before it's really been discussed. And you find yourself trying to catch up. Not with the content, you understand the content, with the conversation beneath the conversation. There's a particular kind of disorientation in that moment, because officially the meeting's only just begun, but somehow the thinking is already in motion. Positions have started to form. Concerns have already been raised somewhere. Support has already been gathered. And you're sitting there with the uneasy sense that the room has arrived at a point you didn't know it was travelling toward. I've heard women describe this experience in many different ways. They'll say, I felt like I was behind before I even opened my mouth. Or, it was as if everybody already knew what the real issue was. Or, I thought we were there to discuss it, but it seemed like the decision had already been made. Sometimes that's literally true. Sometimes the decision has effectively been made elsewhere. But often it's more subtle than that. The formal decision may still be open. The options may genuinely still be on the table. But the emotional and relational groundwork has already begun. People have had conversations. They've tested their reactions. They've floated concerns. They've checked whether others are seeing what they're seeing. They've asked someone they trust, what do you make of this? None of this necessarily looks political. It may not feel strategic. It often happens in completely ordinary ways. A quick conversation after another meeting. A message sent late in the afternoon. A phone call on the way home. A passing comment over coffee. A quiet, can I run something past you? And by the time the formal meeting arrives, people are no longer encountering the issue for the first time. They've already begun making meaning around it. They've placed it inside a story. They've decided what they're worried about. They've worked out who they trust. They may not have reached a conclusion, but they've already started leaning. And that is important because influence is often described as something that happens when we speak. We imagine the persuasive argument, the compelling presentation, the person who commands the room. We picture influence as a performance, something visible, something happening in the moment. But much of the influence that shapes a meeting has happened before anyone sits down, before the agenda is opened, before the first slide appears, before the person chairing the meeting says, right, shall we get started? This is one of the hidden rules of work. The meeting is not always where the conversation begins. Sometimes it's simply where the conversation becomes visible. And if nobody has ever explained that to you, it's very easy to misunderstand what you're seeing. You may assume someone is naturally persuasive, that they have more confidence, that they're better at thinking on their feet, that their idea was simply stronger, and perhaps some of that is true. But there may be another reason their contribution lands so easily. The room has already had time to become familiar with it. People have already heard parts of the thinking. They've had space to ask questions privately. They've been able to absorb the idea without the pressure of responding publicly. By the time it appears in the meeting, it doesn't feel new. It feels considered. And familiar ideas often feel safer than unfamiliar ones. This is where many capable women find themselves at a disadvantage without understanding why. They believe the meeting is the moment to present the work. So they prepare for the meeting, they gather evidence, refine their argument, anticipate objections, build the perfect case. And then they walk into a room where others have been preparing in an entirely different way. Not necessarily better, just earlier. They've been preparing the people, not just the material. And I want to be careful here because this is often the point where women recoil. They think, so I'm supposed to lobby people now. Do I have to become calculating? Is this just another way of saying I need to play politics? No, that's not where I want to take this conversation. Because influence before the meeting is not automatically manipulation. Sometimes it is. We've all seen situations where decisions are stitched up privately and presented as open discussion. That happens and it deserves to be named. But that's not the whole story. Often what's happening is far more human. People are trying to reduce uncertainty. They're trying to understand the implications. They're making sense of something before they're asked to take a position in front of other people. That's not necessarily sinister. It's how human beings process risk. We like time to think. We like to test ideas. We like to know whether someone else sees what we see. And the more important the decision, the more likely these conversations are to happen. The difficulty arises when some people understand this process instinctively, and others believe the formal meeting is the only conversation that counts. That's the gap I want to explore today. Not how to manipulate outcomes, not how to secure agreement before anyone else gets a say, but how influence really begins, how ideas gather momentum, how people form views, how trust shapes what gets heard, and why some people seem to walk into a meeting already carrying support, while others arrive with excellent work and discover they're starting from the very beginning. In the last episode, we explored the hidden structures operating inside organisations. The formal structure you can see on the organisation chart, and the informal network built through trust, credibility, relationships and reputation. We talked about learning to see the system before rushing to navigate it. Today, we're going to move one step further. Because once you recognise that influence travels through relationships, another question becomes unavoidable. When does influence actually happen? And the answer is, much earlier than most of us were taught to look. The meeting may be where the decision is recorded. It may be where the debate becomes public. It may be where people finally say yes or no. But influence often begins in the quieter moments beforehand, in the conversations where people are still uncertain, where nothing has been formally decided, where someone is simply trying to work out what they think. That's where today's conversation begins. One of the biggest myths about influence is that it's something one person does to another. We imagine influence as persuasion, someone making the compelling argument, delivering the perfect presentation, finding exactly the right words. And sometimes that happens. But if you've ever watched how important decisions are really made inside organisations, you'll notice something different. Very few people like making significant decisions alone. Think about your own experience for a moment. Imagine you're about to make a decision that carries real consequences. Perhaps you're recruiting someone into your team. Perhaps you're deciding whether to invest in a new project. Perhaps you're restructuring a department. Perhaps you're recommending someone for promotion. How often do you simply make the decision in complete isolation? Probably not very often. More likely, you talk it through. You ask someone you trust. You test your thinking. You wonder whether you've missed something. You ask questions like, what do you think? Have you had any experience with this? Am I seeing this clearly? That isn't indecisiveness, it's wisdom. Because human beings make better decisions when they're able to think with other people. In organisational psychology, we sometimes talk about uncertainty reduction. Whenever uncertainty increases, people naturally seek out information. Not just facts, but perspective, reassurance, alternative viewpoints, context. We look for the signals that help us understand whether our thinking is sound. That's a deeply human response. The interesting thing is that we often imagine everyone else makes decisions rationally while we make them relationally. But that's simply not how people work. Even the most analytical leader doesn't rely on analysis alone. Every decision contains both information and interpretation. The spreadsheet might tell you what happened. It won't tell you what it means. The report might identify a risk. It won't tell you how seriously people are taking that risk. The business case may be technically excellent, but someone still has to decide whether they believe it. And belief is rarely built through data alone. It's built through confidence, credibility, experience, trust. That's why relationships matter so much inside organisations, not because they replace competence. Competence remains essential. But competence only answers one question. Can this person do the work? Leadership decisions ask many more. Do I trust their judgment? How do they respond under pressure? Will they bring people with them? Can they navigate uncertainty? These questions can't be answered by a report. They're answered through accumulated experience, through repeated interactions, through hundreds of small observations over time. This is why influence grows differently from authority. Authority can be assigned overnight. Influence rarely can. It accumulates, quietly, conversation by conversation, decision by decision, promise by promise, until one day people begin saying things like, let's ask Sarah what she thinks, or I'd like to hear David's perspective before we decide. Nobody announces that shift. There isn't a ceremony, no certificate arrives. It simply becomes true. And because it happens so gradually, we often don't notice it happening at all. We assume influence belongs to naturally charismatic people, or people who are particularly confident, or particularly extroverted. When you look more closely, something else is often going on. People aren't responding to confidence. They're responding to familiarity, to consistency, to trust that has been built over time. There's an interesting psychological principle known as the mere exposure effect. In simple terms, we're more likely to respond positively to things that feel familiar. Not because they're objectively better, but because familiarity reduces uncertainty. The same principle often operates inside organisations. Ideas that have had time to circulate feel less risky. Not necessarily because they're stronger, but because people have had time to think about them. They've asked questions privately. They've explored their concerns. They've connected the new idea with things they already understand. By the time it reaches the formal meeting, it doesn't feel entirely new anymore. It feels recognisable. And recognisable ideas often require less psychological effort to support. This is why the person introducing the idea in the meeting isn't always the person who created the momentum. Sometimes they're simply the visible part of a much longer conversation. Again, I want to pause here because it's very easy to hear this and conclude that organisations are somehow dishonest. I don't think that's the right conclusion. Messy? Often. Human? Always. Think about your own life outside work. If you were considering moving house or changing careers or making a significant financial decision, would you really wait until one formal conversation to begin thinking about it? Of course not. You'd ask questions. You'd gather perspectives. You'd test possibilities. You'd gradually build confidence. Organisations are no different. They're simply groups of human beings doing exactly the same thing together. The mistake many of us make is assuming the meeting is where people start thinking. In reality, the meeting is often where people reveal what they've already been thinking. That's a profound difference, because once you understand that, the purpose of the meeting begins to change. Instead of seeing it as the place where influence begins, you begin to see it as the place where influence becomes visible. The real work has often been happening much earlier. Not in secret, not through manipulation, but through ordinary human conversations, questions, curiosity, sense-making, the kind of conversations people have every day because they're trying to make good decisions. And once you begin to understand that, another question naturally follows. If influence begins before the meeting, why do some people seem to recognise those opportunities instinctively, while others only discover them after the meeting has already begun? I sometimes think about organisations as having two conversations running all the time. There's the formal conversation. That's the one with the agenda, the meeting invitation, the PowerPoint slides, the minutes, the decision paper. It's visible. It's structured, recorded. But alongside it sits another conversation, one that's much harder to see. It's made up of curiosity, questions, small moments of connection. Someone stopping by your desk and saying, "Can I get your thoughts on something?" It's a 5-minute phone call between meetings, a quick Teams message, a conversation walking back from lunch, a leader quietly testing an idea with someone whose judgment they trust. None of these conversations carry the weight of a formal decision, but together they shape how people arrive at one. Think about the last time someone asked you, "Can I run something past you?" They probably weren't asking you to make the decision. They were asking you to help them think. That's what these conversations are for, sense-making. And sense-making is one of the most important things human beings do together. Because before we can decide, we usually need to understand. We need to work out what something means, whether it's risky, whether it aligns with what we already know, whether other people are seeing the same things we are. This is why ideas rarely move through organisations because they're brilliant. They move because enough people have had enough conversations to understand them. That's a very different process. It also explains something that frustrates many capable women. You spend hours refining the proposal, making the argument stronger, gathering better evidence, only to discover that someone else with a less polished proposal seems to gain support much more easily. At first glance, that can feel deeply unfair. You might conclude that quality doesn't matter, or that politics has won again, but often something much simpler has happened. One proposal entered the room as an idea, the other entered as a familiar conversation. One asked people to begin thinking, the other asked people to continue thinking. Those aren't the same thing. Human beings generally find it easier to continue a conversation than to start one. It doesn't mean the second idea is better. It means it's already had time to settle, to gather questions, to become less unfamiliar. One of the hidden assumptions many of us carry is that fairness means everyone should encounter an idea for the first time at exactly the same moment. That's almost never how organisations work. Not because anyone is trying to exclude people, because work is continuous, conversations overlap, projects evolve, relationships develop, ideas mature gradually. By the time something reaches a formal meeting, it's often already travelled through multiple informal conversations. This is particularly true for complex decisions. The bigger the risk, the more likely people are to seek perspective beforehand. Not permission, perspective. There's an important distinction there. Seeking perspective isn't the same as stitching up an outcome. It's simply recognising that good decisions benefit from multiple viewpoints. And if you've ever been the person someone trusts enough to say, "I'm not sure what I think yet," you've already participated in this process, perhaps without even realising it. I think this is where many women unintentionally disadvantage themselves, not because they lack influence, but because they wait. They wait until the meeting to contribute, until the presentation to explain their thinking, until the decision point to ask important questions. All perfectly reasonable, if you believe the meeting is where the conversation begins. But what if it isn't? What if the meeting is simply where everyone's individual thinking becomes collective thinking? What if your colleagues have already been exploring the issue for days, or even weeks? Suddenly your experience of the meeting makes much more sense. You're not arriving late because you weren't invited. You're just arriving at a different stage of the thinking process. That's an important distinction, because once you understand that, you stop asking, "Why didn't my argument land?" And you begin asking instead, "Where did this conversation actually begin?" That single question changes everything. It shifts your attention away from performance and towards process, away from speaking and towards understanding, away from trying to win the room and towards understanding how the room came to think the way it does. That's political intelligence, not manipulating the conversation, but understanding the conversation that's already unfolding. Because once you can recognise where conversations begin, you stop treating meetings as isolated events. You begin seeing them as one moment in a much longer chain of meaning making. And when you see that, you also begin to recognise something else. The people with the greatest influence aren't necessarily the people talking the most. They're often the people helping others make sense of uncertainty before certainty is expected. And that's a very different kind of influence. At this point, some of you might be feeling a little uncomfortable. Because if influence begins before the meeting, doesn't that just mean networking matters more than competence? Or perhaps you've had another reaction. You might be thinking, "This is exactly the kind of politics I don't want any part of." I understand that reaction. In fact, I think it's one of the reasons many capable women stay out of these conversations altogether. Because somewhere along the way, we've allowed two very different things to become tangled together. The first is political manoeuvring. The second is human sense-making. They're not the same thing. Political manoeuvring is about controlling outcomes. Sense-making is about understanding them. One asks, "How do I get people onto my side?" The other asks, "What are people seeing that I haven't seen yet?" One begins with persuasion. The other begins with curiosity. And curiosity is where I think influence becomes much more ethical and more effective. Imagine you're leading an important piece of work. You've developed a proposal. You've thought carefully about it. Instead of waiting until the meeting to unveil it, you simply begin talking to people. Not to convince them, to learn from them. You ask, "I'm working on something and I'd really value your perspective." Or, What concerns do you think people are likely to have? Or perhaps, what am I missing? Do you notice how different these conversations feel? You're not asking people to agree with you, you're inviting them into the thinking. That changes the emotional dynamic completely. People support what they helped shape, not because they're being manipulated, but because they've had an opportunity to contribute. They've had their questions heard, their concerns acknowledged, their experience respected, and perhaps most importantly, they've had time to make the idea partly their own. That's how collaboration works. Not through surprise, through participation. I think many women have an almost instinctive resistance to anything that feels self-promotional. They don't want to lobby. They don't want to be seen as pushing an agenda. They don't want to be the person who is constantly working the room. And honestly, I don't particularly want that either, because that's not the kind of influence I'm talking about. I'm talking about something much quieter, much more generous, much more aligned with thoughtful leadership. It's the difference between saying, here's my idea, and asking, can we think about this together? One positions you as the owner of the answer. The other positions you as someone genuinely interested in making the thinking stronger. The irony is the second approach often creates far more influence than the first, because people don't feel managed, they feel respected, they feel included. Their intelligence is being invited into the conversation rather than bypassed. That's why I think we've misunderstood networking for a very long time. Networking has acquired a reputation for being transactional. Collect business cards, attend events, make connections because they might be useful one day. If that's networking, I don't think many of us are particularly drawn to it. Relationships built on usefulness rarely become relationships built on trust. But trust is built differently. Trust grows through repeated, authentic interactions. People who consistently listen, people who ask thoughtful questions, people who follow through, people whose judgment proves reliable over time. That's not networking, that's relationship. And organisations run on relationships, not because people are playing favourites, but because trust is one of the ways human beings manage complexity. When the environment is uncertain, we naturally turn towards people whose judgment we've come to respect. Not because they're always right, but because they've earned our confidence. That's exactly what happened with the leader I mentioned in the last episode. She didn't hold influence because she'd mastered office politics. She held influence because over many years people had learned they could trust her judgment. When uncertainty appeared, people naturally sought her perspective. Not because anyone had appointed her to that role, but because the relationship already existed. And perhaps that's the biggest shift I'd like to offer today. What if influence isn't something you build in the meeting, or even for the meeting? What if influence is simply the accumulated result of hundreds of ordinary conversations, handled with curiosity, integrity, and genuine interest in understanding other people? That's a very different picture. It doesn't ask you to become someone more political. It asks you to become someone more connected. Not connected in the sense of knowing more people, connected in the sense of understanding people, understanding how they think, what matters to them, what concerns them, what they're trying to achieve. Because when you understand those things, your conversations stop being about getting agreement. They become opportunities for shared understanding. And shared understanding is where sustainable influence begins. Which brings us to the practical question. If influence really begins before the meeting, what does that actually look like next Monday morning? One of the things I've learned over the years is that leadership development often makes change feel much bigger than it needs to be. We talk about becoming more influential, building our executive presence, developing strategic relationships. And while all of those things matter, they can also feel overwhelming, especially if you've spent your career believing that good work should speak for itself. So I'd like to leave you with something much smaller, something you could try this week. Not because it's a technique, but because it changes where you place your attention. The next time you're preparing for an important meeting, I'd like you to ask yourself one question. Who would benefit from thinking about this before we're all sitting around the table? Not because you want to persuade them, but because you want to understand them. Maybe it's someone who's likely to be affected by the decision. Maybe it's someone whose judgment you respect. Maybe it's someone who always notices risks that you overlook. Or perhaps it's someone who sees the organisation from a completely different perspective. Then simply have a conversation. Not a presentation, not a rehearsal, a conversation. You might say, I've been thinking about something we'll be discussing next week. I'd really value your perspective. Or, I'm curious what you're seeing from where you sit. Or even, is there anything you think I'm not considering? That's it. Notice what happens when you approach the conversation with curiosity rather than certainty. Notice what you learn. Notice how your own thinking evolves. Because something interesting happens when we stop treating preparation as something we do alone. Our ideas become stronger. Not because we've defended them more effectively, but because we've allowed them to be shaped by other people's thinking. There's another benefit too. People remember how they felt during a conversation. If someone leaves feeling heard, feeling respected, feeling their perspective genuinely mattered, they're much more likely to stay engaged with the conversation that follows. Not because you've won them over, but because you've worked something out together. That's a very different foundation for influence. It also changes something inside us. Many women carry an enormous amount of pressure into important meetings. Pressure to have the perfect answer. Pressure to anticipate every objection. Pressure to be absolutely certain before they speak. But when you've already had one or two thoughtful conversations, that pressure softens. You're no longer carrying the whole idea by yourself. You've already tested it. You've already discovered where people have questions. You've already learned which parts resonate and which parts need more thinking. The meeting becomes less about defending your position and more about continuing a conversation that's already begun. And that's a much lighter place to lead from. Now, I also want to acknowledge something. Not every organisation makes these conversations easy. Some cultures are highly collaborative and others are much more transactional. Some leaders genuinely welcome early dialogue. Others prefer everything to happen in the formal meeting. That's why I keep coming back to observation. Before you change your behaviour, observe the system. Notice how people around you already work. How do ideas gain momentum? Where do thoughtful conversations naturally happen? Who seems comfortable asking for perspective before decisions are made? Remember, we're not trying to copy someone else's behaviour. We're trying to understand the terrain we're walking through. Because political intelligence has never been about using the same strategy everywhere. It's about responding intelligently to the context you're actually in. And sometimes, the most influential thing you can do isn't speaking more persuasively in the meeting. It's asking one thoughtful question to one trusted person a few days beforehand. That single conversation might not change the outcome, but it will almost certainly change your understanding. And understanding is where influence begins. If you'd like to take this a little further, I've also created a companion resource for this episode called Field Guide 2, Influence Before the Meeting. It's designed to help you map the conversations that happen before the meeting, recognise where ideas gather momentum in your own organisation, and reflect on how influence is already moving through the relationships around you. You can download it free using the link in the show notes. Like all of the field guides this season, it isn't homework. It's simply a way of slowing down long enough to notice what's probably been happening around you all along. As we finish today, I'd like to leave you with one final thought. The easiest conversations to notice are the ones we can hear. The meeting, the presentation, the debate, the decision. They're visible, they're scheduled, they feel important. But some of the most influential conversations inside an organisation leave no record at all. They're the 5 minutes after a meeting ends, the walk back to someone's office, the phone call on the drive home, the quiet moment when someone says, "I've been thinking about what you said." Those conversations rarely appear in the minutes. Nobody records them. Nobody adds them to the project plan. And yet they often shape everything that comes afterwards. Once you begin to notice that, it's very difficult to see organisations in quite the same way again. You stop believing that influence belongs only to the loudest voice. You stop assuming that every important decision happens in the room. You stop thinking that preparation begins the night before the meeting. Instead, you begin to see organisations as ongoing conversations, living systems where ideas are constantly forming, being tested, being refined, and gradually gathering trust. That doesn't mean you need to be part of every conversation. It doesn't mean you spend your days trying to influence everyone around you. In fact, it's quite the opposite. It means you can become much more intentional. You begin asking yourself, where are the conversations that genuinely matter? Who might help me see something I haven't seen? How can I enter these conversations with curiosity rather than certainty? Those are very different questions from how do I get people to agree with me? Because ultimately, influence isn't about getting your own way. It's about helping better thinking emerge. Sometimes that means changing other people's minds. Sometimes it means changing your own. Both are valuable. Next time you walk into an important meeting, remember this. The meeting isn't the whole conversation. It's simply the part you can see. And as you become more aware of the conversations that happen before, around, and beyond the meeting, you'll begin to notice something else. Some people seem to read these invisible currents almost instinctively. They know when a room is ready to move. They notice what isn't being said. They sense shifts before they become obvious. It's almost though they're reading something everyone else is missing. In our next episode, that's exactly what we're going to explore. Because one of the most underrated leadership capabilities isn't speaking, it's reading the room. Until then, don't just pay attention to what happens in the meeting. Pay attention to what happens before anyone sits down. You might discover that's where influence has been quietly beginning all along. Thanks for joining me on the Archetype Effect. If this episode sparked an insight, share it with a woman who leads, or leave a review so more women can find these conversations. Until next time, lead with purpose and power that feels like you.